On a December morning in 1942, the Tunisian desert stretched endlessly under a pale sky, its horizon blurred by waves of heat that rose from the sand and stone. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim stood atop a low ridge, his uniform already dusty from the dry wind that swept across the North African landscape. He had commanded troops across multiple theatres, witnessed the machinery of modern warfare in all its terrible efficiency, and yet what he observed through his field glasses that morning defied his expectations entirely. A column was approaching from the east, moving with unusual speed across terrain that should have slowed any conventional military convoy. Von Arnim adjusted the focus on his binoculars, expecting to identify the familiar profiles of Sherman tanks or perhaps the bulky shapes of armoured half-tracks that American forces typically deployed. What he saw instead puzzled him deeply. The vehicles cresting the ridge were small, almost comically so, compared to the heavy machinery he associated with modern mechanized warfare. They were boxy, open-topped contraptions that seemed to bounce across the rocky desert floor with an agility that bordered on reckless. They moved in swarms, dozens of them, perhaps more, each one kicking up its own trail of dust as they navigated the uneven terrain at speeds that seemed impossible for their size. A young lieutenant standing beside the general lowered his own field glasses and spoke, his voice carrying a mixture of confusion and dismissal. He used the German term for toy cars, suggesting these vehicles looked more like playthings than serious military equipment. Von Arnim didn't share his subordinate's amusement. He had learned through bitter experience not to underestimate anything the Americans brought to the battlefield. What he was witnessing, though he couldn't fully grasp it at that moment, was the deployment of what would become one of the most significant tactical advantages of the entire global conflict. The vehicle in question was the Willys MB, though it would become universally known by its simpler, more memorable designation. This unpretentious machine would ultimately come to represent American industrial and logistical superiority more effectively than any of the larger, more imposing weapons systems that typically captured the public imagination. By the time the war reached its conclusion, American manufacturing facilities had produced an almost incomprehensible quantity of these vehicles, approaching 650,000 units in total. To put this figure in perspective, it meant there was essentially one of these versatile machines available for every 50 American service members who participated in the conflict. For German commanders, who had spent years managing armies that still relied heavily on horse-drawn wagons for significant portions of their logistics, who operated under constant fuel rationing, and who struggled to maintain even basic transportation infrastructure, these production numbers seemed to belong to a completely different reality. Throughout the war, the German military machine had wrestled with chronic transportation inadequacies. Their logistics networks depended substantially on requisitioned civilian vehicles, trucks of varying makes and models with no standardized parts, and in the desperate conditions of the Eastern Front, they had even resorted to using oxen for transport. Against this background of scarcity and improvisation, they now faced an enemy that had essentially given every small unit the capability to operate independently and move with unprecedented freedom. The contrast could not have been more stark or more demoralizing. Intelligence reports compiled by Nazi military analysts had previously assessed this particular American vehicle with a combination of skepticism and derision. Their conclusions had categorized it as impractical, a gimmick, perhaps even a sign of American industrial frivolity rather than serious military planning. These assessments would prove to be among the most catastrophically incorrect intelligence failures of the war, with consequences that rippled through every theatre where German and American forces met. The story of how this revolutionary vehicle came into existence began in the summer of 1940, when the United States Army, recognizing the changing nature of modern warfare and the increasing importance of mobility, issued what seemed like an almost impossible set of specifications. The military wanted a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle with four-wheel drive capability, weighing no more than 1,300 pounds, yet capable of carrying a crew and mounting a machine gun. This vehicle needed to be able to climb grades as steep as 60% and reach speeds of 50 miles per hour on suitable terrain. The requirements were so demanding that only 2 manufacturers initially believed they could meet the challenge within the Army's aggressive timeline. American Bantam, a small automobile company, stepped forward first. They produced the initial prototype that demonstrated the concept could work, proving that such a vehicle was feasible rather than merely theoretical. However, it was Willys Overland that refined and perfected the design, developing what they called the Go Devil engine, a 60-horsepower power plant that gave the compact vehicle a surprising amount of strength and reliability. Ford Motor Company soon joined the production effort as well, bringing their massive manufacturing capacity to bear on the project. Ford's contribution was significant not just in volume, but in standardization. They stamped identifying marks on virtually every component they manufactured, contributing to a level of parts interchangeability that became legendary among the troops who depended on these vehicles. American soldiers, with their characteristic humor, often joked that the standardization was so complete that you could remove a bolt manufactured at one factory and install it in a vehicle assembled at a completely different facility without any modification or adjustment whatsoever. When German officers eventually captured one of these vehicles intact and conducted a detailed examination, they were genuinely astonished by what they discovered. Every part carried clear identification numbers, and the components were designed with such precision that they could be swapped between vehicles with complete confidence. This represented a philosophical approach to engineering that was almost alien to German manufacturing culture, which had traditionally emphasized skilled craftsmanship and custom fitting rather than mass production and universal compatibility. By the middle of 1942, the production lines had reached a rhythm that seemed almost fantastical. American factories were completing one fully assembled vehicle every 2 minutes of every working day. To truly understand the scale of this industrial achievement, one needs to consider the specifics. Ford's massive River Rouge plant in Michigan, one of the largest integrated industrial complexes in the world, had dedicated production lines that could complete 100 of these vehicles in a single hour. These lines operated continuously, 24 hours a day, with workers rotating in shifts to maintain uninterrupted output. During the same 60-minute period that Germany might complete the assembly of one elaborate staff car built with traditional methods and custom components, America was producing dozens upon dozens of these standardized utility vehicles. The mathematics of industrial capacity were shifting the fundamental balance of the war in ways that battlefield tactics alone could never achieve. The vehicle's capabilities extended far beyond simple road transportation. With its 4-wheel drive system and specially designed leaf spring suspension, it could navigate terrain that would immobilize conventional trucks and automobiles. It could push through thick mud that would trap heavier vehicles, maintain traction on snow and ice where other machines would slide helplessly, cross desert sand that swallowed the wheels of standard military transport, and penetrate jungle environments where roads simply didn't exist. It could ford streams and rivers with water levels that reached halfway up its sides, climb embankments that seemed impossibly steep, and execute turning maneuvers in spaces far tighter than any German truck could manage. These capabilities weren't theoretical or exaggerated for propaganda purposes. They were demonstrated daily across every continent where the war was being fought. Soldiers in the field, practical men who cared about results rather than engineering elegance, quickly recognized that they had been given something far more valuable than just another piece of transportation equipment. This was a universal tool, adaptable to virtually any task that circumstances might demand. They began mounting stretchers across the hood and sides, converting the vehicle into an improvised ambulance that could reach wounded men in forward positions where conventional medical transport could never venture. They installed machine guns on swivel mounts, creating mobile fire platforms that could quickly reposition during engagements. They fitted communications equipment, transforming isolated units into networked elements of a larger tactical picture. They attached towing hitches and used the vehicles to haul everything from artillery pieces to supply trailers across terrain where such movement had previously seemed impossible. The versatility became legendary, spawning countless field modifications and adaptations that no design engineer had ever formally planned. In some units, enterprising mechanics welded additional armor plating to protect drivers in combat zones. In others, soldiers mounted anti-aircraft weapons or rocket launchers, creating hybrid platforms that blurred the traditional distinctions between vehicle classifications. The vehicle's open design and simple mechanical systems encouraged this kind of creative adaptation in a way that more complex enclosed vehicles never could. Every unit seemed to find new uses, new configurations, new ways to leverage this remarkably flexible platform. Soviet forces receiving these vehicles through the Lend-Lease program demonstrated perhaps the most creative tactical applications. Russian soldiers, fighting under the most brutal conditions of the entire war, immediately recognized the value of what they had been given. They nicknamed it the American Mule, a term that captured both its humble appearance and its incredible usefulness. Red Army units deployed these vehicles in roles that would have seemed inconceivable to their original designers. At Stalingrad, where every building was a fortress and every street a killing ground, Soviet forces used them as forward artillery spotters. Small teams would dash through the rubble-strewn urban landscape in these nimble vehicles, racing through gaps in the German defensive lines to establish observation positions. From these forward positions, they could radio targeting coordinates to Katyusha rocket batteries positioned kilometers behind the front lines. The famous Soviet rocket artillery would then unleash devastating salvos onto German positions identified by spotters driving what appeared to be nothing more than a civilian runabout. German troops found themselves under artillery bombardment directed by spotters they couldn't effectively engage or even properly track. The traditional counters to artillery observation, such as targeting static observation posts or shooting down reconnaissance aircraft, proved useless against these mobile, ground-level spotters who could appear anywhere, relay their information, and vanish into the urban chaos before effective countermeasures could be organized. The psychological impact of being observed and targeted by such unconventional means added another layer of stress to troops already fighting under impossibly difficult conditions. In North Africa, where Erwin Rommel commanded the Afrika Korps with tactical brilliance that had earned him legendary status, the disparity in logistical capabilities became impossible to ignore. Rommel's forces depended on a chaotic mixture of captured British trucks, fuel-hungry German vehicles that performed poorly in desert conditions, and whatever else they could requisition or improvise. Sandstorms, which swept across the desert with punishing regularity, were particularly devastating to German motorized units. Complex engine systems became clogged with fine sand particles, sophisticated mechanical components seized up, and maintenance crews struggled desperately to keep vehicles operational in an environment that seemed designed to destroy machinery. Meanwhile, American forces were demonstrating mobility that seemed to defy the limitations of the desert environment. Their vehicles skipped across sand dunes that would have trapped German trucks, maintained reliable operation through sandstorms that disabled more sophisticated machines, and moved ammunition, water and supplies to forward units with a speed and consistency that the Afrika Korps could never match. The Americans could reinforce success, exploit breakthroughs, and respond to threats with a flexibility that fundamentally altered the tactical calculations of desert warfare. A German staff report compiled in early 1943, written in the carefully neutral language of military assessment but unable to completely hide the frustration of its authors, recorded the following observation. The enemy possessed a small motor vehicle capable of sustaining long marches and carrying both personnel and equipment across terrain that German machines simply could not cross. The report concluded that American mobility exceeded German capabilities in every measurable category. This was an extraordinary admission for a military culture that had built its reputation on mechanized warfare and mobile operations. The blitzkrieg tactics that had conquered most of Europe depended fundamentally on mechanical mobility, yet here was an acknowledgement that the Germans had been comprehensively outclassed in this critical domain. The psychological dimension of this technological disparity operated on multiple levels and proved just as significant as the tactical advantages. To German officers, many of whom came from aristocratic military traditions that stretched back centuries, warfare was supposed to be conducted with appropriately grand instruments. War machines should be impressive, imposing tanks that dominated battlefields through sheer mass and firepower, sleek aircraft that represented the cutting edge of technological achievement, massive artillery pieces that demonstrated industrial might through their very scale. The vehicle the Americans had chosen to emphasize looked absurd by these standards. It was small, simple, utilitarian to the point of appearing crude, and completely lacking in the aesthetic qualities that German military culture associated with serious weapons systems. Yet this very humility, this apparent simplicity, concealed the vehicle's revolutionary significance. It represented a completely different philosophy of warfare, one that prioritized practical utility over impressive appearance, that valued reliability over sophistication, that understood that wars were ultimately won through the accumulation of countless small tactical advantages rather than a few dramatic technological breakthroughs. General Dwight Eisenhower, who commanded the Allied forces in Europe and who understood perhaps better than anyone the relationship between logistics and victory, would later identify this humble vehicle as one of the 3 truly decisive weapons systems of the entire war. He placed it alongside the C-47 transport aircraft and the specialized landing craft that made amphibious operations possible. This assessment from one of the war's most successful commanders spoke volumes about the vehicle's actual strategic importance, regardless of how unimpressive it might have appeared to observers focused on traditional measures of military power. When von Arnim's staff officers attempted to calculate how many of these vehicles the Americans had deployed in Tunisia, they worked through the intelligence reports and reconnaissance data and arrived at conclusions that they themselves found difficult to believe. Their final assessment was that the Americans must have been inflating the figures for propaganda purposes. Surely, they reasoned, no country would allocate such enormous resources to producing so many small, seemingly insignificant cars, when those same resources could have been devoted to manufacturing additional tanks, aircraft, or artillery. The very idea seemed to violate basic principles of military resource allocation. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known without understanding the fundamental nature of American industrial capacity, was that at the exact moment they were compiling these skeptical reports, additional thousands of these vehicles were being unloaded at ports in Algiers and Oran. Each vehicle arrived packed in a wooden crate, like components of some enormous construction kit, ready to be assembled and distributed to units across the theatre. This was another aspect of the vehicle's revolutionary design that German logistics officers found almost impossible to credit when they first encountered reports about it. A fully functional military vehicle could be disassembled, packed into a wooden crate not much larger than a large piece of furniture, shipped thousands of miles across submarine-infested oceans, and then reassembled by a team of just 4 men in less than 60 minutes. American quartermasters, responsible for moving millions of tons of equipment across the globe, loved this characteristic. It meant that shipping space could be used with maximum efficiency, that vehicles could be transported safely without risk of damage, and that deployment could happen with unprecedented speed once supplies reached their destination. German supply officers, reading intelligence reports describing vehicles arriving in boxes that could be assembled on site, dismissed these accounts as obvious propaganda. They assumed, quite reasonably given their own experience with complex military equipment, that such reports must be American exaggerations designed to create an impression of unlimited industrial capacity. The truth, however, was that the vehicle's modularity and standardization made it arguably the most deployable vehicle in the history of warfare up to that point. This wasn't an incremental improvement over previous designs. It represented a complete reimagining of how military transportation could function in a global conflict where forces needed to be supplied across vast distances and diverse environments. The true magnitude of the strategic advantage became undeniable in Europe following the Normandy invasion in June 1944. After Allied forces established their beachhead and began pushing inland, these vehicles became the literal arteries of the entire advance. They carried generals like George Patton, who famously preferred travelling in an open vehicle despite the security risks because it allowed him to maintain constant visual contact with his troops and the terrain. They transported medical personnel under fire, racing wounded soldiers to field hospitals where every minute could mean the difference between survival and death. They carried chaplains who needed to reach scattered units to conduct services and provide spiritual support to men facing the possibility of death every day. They even transported visiting Hollywood stars like Clark Gable, who toured frontline positions to boost morale and bring a touch of home to soldiers fighting thousands of miles from America. German prisoners, marched into captivity along roads controlled by Allied forces, found themselves walking past seemingly endless rows of these vehicles parked nose to nose along roadsides, in fields, in town squares, anywhere there was space. The vehicles stretched for miles in every direction, an unending river of olive-drab metal and black rubber that seemed to have no beginning or end. For men who had spent years fighting under conditions of perpetual shortage, who had seen their own units struggle to maintain basic transportation, who had watched their logistics networks steadily deteriorate under the pressures of Allied bombing and material attrition, the sight carried a devastating psychological message. It seemed as though American factories had simply decided to provide every individual soldier with his own personal automobile, an allocation of resources that defied everything they understood about military economics. In one letter that was intercepted and preserved in captured mail, a German soldier wrote to his wife back home in language that captured the surreal quality of what he was experiencing. He described how the Americans drove to war as if they were going on holiday, how even their officers rode in open cars while German troops marched on foot for kilometers every day. He concluded with a statement that was both complaint and bewildered observation. It was not fair. It was not possible. These words revealed the profound cognitive dissonance of soldiers trained to believe in German technological and organizational superiority, suddenly confronted with evidence of their enemy's overwhelming material advantages. The reality behind what appeared to be profligate waste was actually industrial democracy in action, a concept that German military culture had never fully embraced or even properly understood. The vehicle's mechanical simplicity meant that virtually anyone could learn to operate it with minimal training. A farmer conscripted from Kansas, a man whose mechanical experience consisted of maintaining agricultural equipment, could learn to drive and maintain this military vehicle within days. A teenager from Brooklyn, whose previous experience with machinery might have been limited to the subway system, could swap out the transmission in the middle of a muddy field using basic tools and field manual instructions. The vehicle didn't require specialized technicians or factory-trained mechanics. Any reasonably competent person with basic mechanical aptitude could perform most repairs and maintenance tasks. Spare parts flowed through the logistics system with such abundance that American mechanics sometimes assembled entire vehicles from leftover components and salvaged parts, creating unofficial additions to their unit's transportation pool. This kind of field improvisation, which would have been considered irregular or even criminal in the rigid German military supply system, was actively encouraged in American forces as a demonstration of initiative and resourcefulness. German generals, accustomed to operating under conditions where even basic components were strictly rationed and controlled, where every part had to be accounted for and justified, could only observe this abundance with a mixture of envy and incomprehension. By the time the war approached its conclusion, these vehicles had appeared in virtually every theatre and environment where combat occurred. They were present on the beaches of Normandy during the initial landings, providing immediate mobility to troops storming ashore. They operated in Italian vineyards, navigating between ancient stone walls and through medieval village streets never designed for motor vehicles. They pushed through Burmese jungles, where the combination of extreme humidity, dense vegetation, and primitive roads destroyed more sophisticated machinery. They were even deployed on Pacific Islands, where Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, strapped them to landing barges and drove them ashore through surf and sand to begin supporting operations on newly captured territory within hours of the initial assault. The vehicle's versatility seemed limited only by the imagination of the soldiers using them. They pulled artillery pieces ranging from small anti-tank guns to much heavier howitzers, effectively giving units the ability to reposition their fire support with unprecedented speed. They carried radar sets that needed to be moved frequently to avoid enemy targeting. They hauled mail, maintaining the crucial psychological connection between frontline troops and home. They delivered generals to formal surrender ceremonies, providing an appropriately mobile platform for officers who had commanded mobile warfare. When General Douglas MacArthur accepted Japan's formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, one of these vehicles drove him onto the deck of the battleship, making it present at the ceremonial ending of the conflict, just as it had been present at so many of the war's crucial tactical moments. Symbolically, this simple American vehicle had outlasted every one of the Reich's most celebrated weapons systems. The massive Tiger tanks that had struck such fear into Allied tankers, the advanced jet aircraft that had represented cutting-edge aviation technology, the V-2 rockets that had seemed like weapons from a future age of warfare, all of these impressive technologies had been defeated not just by their direct military counterparts, but by the accumulated weight of Allied logistical superiority that vehicles like this represented. The Germans had built weapons designed to win battles. The Americans had built systems designed to win wars. The difference proved decisive. For German commanders and staff officers, encountering this vehicle in action constituted both a revelation and a humiliation that many found difficult to process or accept. Their armies had dismissed it as a toy, a product of American industrial frivolity and lack of serious military culture. Instead, they learned through bitter experience that it was actually the most effective workhorse in the most effective military logistics system ever created to that point in history. When von Arnim finally surrendered his forces in Tunisia in May 1943, captured documents later revealed that his staff officers had asked their American counterparts one final time about the actual numbers of these vehicles in theatre. The Americans, amused by the persistence of the question and perhaps understanding the psychological importance it represented, responded with laughter. How many did they have? Enough. That single word encapsulated everything about the strategic situation. That simple response carried profound implications that extended far beyond its surface meaning. America hadn't merely built a successful military vehicle. They had constructed a symbol of industrial might so overwhelming that precise numbers became almost irrelevant. They had created a machine so fundamentally ordinary in appearance and concept that it became extraordinary through sheer ubiquity and reliability. By 1945, with approximately 500,000 of these vehicles operating simultaneously across the globe, German generals finally understood the mathematics of industrial warfare in the modern age. Each individual vehicle might be small, might seem insignificant when considered in isolation, might not represent any particular technological breakthrough or impressive engineering achievement. But when multiplied by hundreds of thousands, when deployed with the systematic thoroughness that characterized American logistics, when supported by an industrial base that could maintain production and supply spare parts continuously throughout years of global warfare, that humble machine became overwhelming in a way that no amount of tactical brilliance or battlefield courage could overcome. The war had not been won exclusively through the deployment of the most powerful tanks or the most devastating bomber aircraft, though those certainly played crucial roles. Sometimes, perhaps more often than military historians traditionally acknowledged, wars were won through the accumulation of countless small advantages, through superior logistics and mobility, through the kind of unglamorous but essential capabilities that a simple four-wheeled machine represented. This particular vehicle could travel anywhere geography permitted, could perform virtually any task that military operations required, and would simply never stop working no matter how demanding the conditions or how extended the campaign. That combination of universality, reliability, and abundance ultimately proved more strategically decisive than any number of technically impressive but logistically unsustainable weapons systems. The lesson was clear to those willing to see it. though it contradicted much of what traditional military thinking had emphasized. Modern industrial warfare would be won not by those who built the most impressive weapons, but by those who could deploy adequate weapons in overwhelming numbers with unbreakable reliability. America had understood this fundamental truth and built accordingly, and that understanding had helped win the war.